What happened in those English towns wasn't a crime wave. It was a harvest. Raymond Ibrahim spent his career translating Arabic texts that explain why these men targeted non-Muslim girls for over 10 years. Those texts describe a theology of lawful spoils, and that theology has existed for 14 centuries. Between 1997 and 2013, in the town of Rotherham alone, approximately 1,400 children were sexually exploited by organized networks of men. That figure comes from the J Report, the independent inquiry led by Professor Alexis J. in 2014. It's not an estimate from a newspaper. It's the official count, and it documents a pattern that stretched across more than a decade, while the authorities knew and failed to act. The method was consistent across multiple towns. Older men befriended vulnerable girls, often in care or from unstable homes, grooming them with gifts, attention, and drugs, before subjecting them to rape, trafficking, and organized abuse. The same pattern surfaced in Rochdale, Telford, Oxford, Derby, Bristol, Newcastle, and Aylesbury. Each town produced its own inquiry, its own set of convictions, and its own catalog of official failures. Police officers dismissed victims as unreliable witnesses. Social workers feared being labeled racist. Local councils buried reports that named the ethnicity of the perpetrators because the truth did not fit the preferred narrative. Operation Stovewood, the major police investigation into Rotherham, identified 323 suspects. Convictions followed, and the perpetrators in the documented cases were predominantly men of British Pakistani heritage. The then Home Secretary Priti Patel acknowledged publicly that drawing conclusions about the characteristics of offenders has been difficult. The official narrative settled on comfortable explanations, calling the crisis a failure of integration, organized crime, and a child protection breakdown. And every one of those labels treated the perpetrators as if they were operating without a doctrine. Not one official report asked what the men believed they were doing. The scale alone makes the official explanations collapse under their own weight. 1,400 children in one town implies a network, a method, and a shared logic that integration seminars and policing reforms cannot account for. Something else was driving the pattern. The record shows it plainly. The victims told the police what was happening. The police told the victims they were making it up. Most people still believe the authorities simply failed to act. The truth is more specific than that. The authorities failed to understand what they were looking at. But to call this a policing failure is to miss the logic the perpetrators brought to it. If this were merely organized crime or cultural misunderstanding, the targeting would have been random, or at least varied. It was not. The girls were overwhelmingly white and British, and from non-Muslim backgrounds. The perpetrators were overwhelmingly Muslim men of Pakistani heritage, who operated in groups, moved victims between town boundaries, and used the same methods for more than a decade. The Baroness Casey review, published in 2025, noted explicitly that Asian men were involved in child sex grooming gangs, in the specific case of Operation Stovewood. Dr. Mark Dury, an Anglican priest and scholar, has argued that the common factor isn't ethnicity, but theology. The authorities have spent 15 years looking for economic or social explanations while avoiding the question the perpetrators themselves were answering with their actions. They targeted non-Muslim girls deliberately. They operated in organized groups for more than a decade. They passed victims between town boundaries as if the girls were property to be traded between allies. And they believed, by every account that has emerged from the trials, that their actions carried a sanction beyond any law of England. To understand what the perpetrators believed they were doing, you need to understand a doctrine that most Western commentators have never encountered. It's called al-wala, wal-bara, and it translates roughly as loyalty and enmity. The doctrine holds that a Muslim owes absolute loyalty to other Muslims and active enmity toward non-Muslims. It's not a fringe idea manufactured by modern extremists, but a doctrine rooted in the Quran and taught in mainstream jurisprudence for centuries. Quran 60, verse 4, records Abraham and his followers telling their pagan people, "We have rejected you, and enmity and hatred have appeared between us and you forever, until you believe in Allah alone." That verse is the foundation of the doctrine. The message isn't that non-Muslims are merely different or mistaken. The message is that the relationship is structurally hostile, permanent, and irreconcilable. until conversion occurs. In the radical interpretation that drives certain jihadist ideologies, to love or respect the non-Muslim is a violation of loyalty to the faith itself. This isn't modern bigotry dressed in religious language. It's a theological category. The non-Muslim isn't a neighbor with whom you disagree, but the enemy, and the relationship is defined by perpetual war until submission. This doctrine doesn't encourage random violence. It encourages structured exploitation. The enemy isn't to be negotiated with. The enemy must be subdued, taxed, or taken. In practical terms, al-wala, wal-bara, creates a moral wall between the believer and the society he inhabits. He lives among non-Muslims, but he doesn't belong to them. He takes their welfare, their housing, and their protections, but he owes them nothing in return. When you grasp this framework, the targeting of white British girls stops looking like a crime of opportunity and starts looking like the application of a legal code. The girls weren't fellow citizens with rights. In the theological logic that governed the perpetrators, they were the enemy population, and the enemy population is lawful to exploit. But enmity alone doesn't explain this specific method. For that, you need to understand what the theology says about spoils. The Arabic term is ganima, and it refers to the spoils of war. The Quran addresses spoils directly, and the classical framework counted captives among them. The Quran also addresses captives directly. Quran 4, verse 24, states that all married women are forbidden to the believer except those whom your right hands possess. The classical tafsirs are explicit on what this means. Ibn Kathir, among the most respected commentators in Sunni Islam, interprets this verse as referring to captive women taken in war. His commentary leaves no ambiguity about the category. Tafhim al-Quran, the commentary by Abu Ayla Maududi, is even more direct. It explains that women who come as captives of war, leaving their husbands behind in the domain of war, are not prohibited because their marriage is nullified by virtue of their entry into the domain of Islam. Quran 33, verse 50, makes the point explicit in the context of the Prophet himself. It declares that Allah has made lawful to the Prophet his wives and those his right hand possesses. From the captives Allah has returned to him. The term malakat aymanukum, those whom your right hands possess, appears repeatedly throughout the Quran. It's not an ambiguous phrase. In classical jurisprudence, it's the legal category for captives, including women who become lawful for sexual use outside of marriage. This is where Raymond Ibrahim's scholarship provides the analytical key. And what he found changes how you read every official report. Ibrahim, who spent his career translating Arabic primary sources, argues that in the radical interpretation, Britain isn't seen as a neutral society with which Islam coexists. Britain is seen as the domain of war. And in the domain of war, the women of the enemy population are lawful spoils. They are sabaya. The perpetrators didn't believe they were committing crimes. In their framework, they were collecting ghanima. This isn't a new idea applied to a new continent. The historical record shows the same pattern for 14 centuries. From the 7th century to the 19th, Muslim powers extracted human capital from non-Muslim populations as a matter of systematic policy. The Ottomans practiced what they called the devshirme, usually translated as the child levy or the blood tax. Ottoman officials would enter Christian villages in the Balkans and forcibly take boys between the ages of 8 and 18 from their families. The Ottomans converted the boys to Islam, trained them as soldiers or administrators, and repurposed them as instruments of the state that had conquered their homelands. The practice lasted for roughly 3 centuries. The Barbary corsairs of North Africa conducted slave raids against European coastal towns from the 16th century to the 19th. They raided as far north as Iceland and the British Isles. Historians estimate that raiders captured and sold over 1 million Europeans into slavery in North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. The raids targeted specifically Christian populations. These were not random victims of piracy. They were the spoils of a theological war, taken from the house of war and distributed as lawful property. Raymond Ibrahim's book, Sword and Scimitar, published in 2018, traces this 1400-year arc through the Arabic primary sources. The common thread in Ibrahim's reading isn't merely slavery as an economic institution, it's the theological authorization to treat non-Muslim populations as resources to be harvested. The boys of the Balkans were taken because they were Christian. The women of the Barbary coast were taken because they were European. and non-Muslim. The girls of Rotherham were targeted because they were white and British and outside the faith. The modern UK grooming gangs lack the formal state sponsorship of the devshirme or the Barbary raids. But the logic, Ibrahim argues, is identical. The only difference is that informal networks now operate where the state once did, exploiting a vacuum of understanding. Which brings us to the question the historical record actually answers. The strategic purpose of the harvest is demoralization. By targeting the women of a society, you break the protective instinct of the men and the continuity of the culture itself. The fathers can't protect their daughters, the brothers can't protect their sisters. The community learns that its own laws won't defend it. It's a form of dimitude imposed through fear rather than formal conquest. The population submits not because an army has marched through the gates, but because the cost of remaining what they are has become unbearable. And there's a second purpose, the incentive to convert. If life for a non-Muslim woman in those towns is one of perpetual risk and degradation, the escape offered by conversion looks like mercy. The hate makes the environment unbearable, and the scripture provides the only door. It's a psychological pincer movement that has been documented across 14 centuries of conflict. But the most dangerous implication is this. Legal deterrents don't work against men who believe they're at war. When a perpetrator believes his actions are divinely sanctioned, state punishment is not deterrence. It's persecution of his faith. The British legal system was designed to stop criminals who fear prison. It wasn't designed to stop men who believe they're claiming lawful spoils in a war that never ended. The authorities' paralysis isn't simply political correctness, though that played its part. It's civilizational incomprehension. They're trying to stop a theological war with the instruments of ordinary law enforcement. The men who committed these acts believed they were obeying a divine law. Until we acknowledge what that law actually says, we're not dealing with the reality in front of us. We're dealing with the version we wish were true. The historical record doesn't sanitize itself for modern comfort. It records what was done, who did it, and what they believed they were doing. Those who don't know what happened are condemned to misunderstand what's happening now. Subscribe if you want the record, not the revision. The past has more to say.